ending, but as storytelling goes, it ended on a high note, and I appreciated that. I don't need any more gloom, really.
I mean, for me, the irony is that the ending was that there is no ending, and that we find ourselves today sitting here very much feeling, living the continuation of what was not achieved at that point 30 years ago. And I think I think about, I was quite young then, so I didn't have the political consciousness to kind of realize where we are in the moment, but I can't help but look back at the mid-90s, and I'm also thinking about the 90s, and I'm thinking about Rwanda, I'm thinking about Bosnia, Kosovo to follow, Northern Ireland to follow. It was it was very turbulent times, and many parts in the world, from Liberia and Sierra Leone to East Timor, got to see an end in that decade. Even some after more than 30 years. But Israel and Palestine did not.
Well, I thought it was an important play, and it came at the right time. I think we're seeing an uptick in, unfortunately, in assassinations and political violence, in the city, repeatedly over the past 2 years since October 7th. We're seeing people willing to take matters into their own hands in this violent way. And so I thought it was timely for us to see that. It was an incredible feat to put it to music, so thank you for livening up like that. I think it was important to bring back some of the arguments that era introduced us to, especially to a newer audience that might have not heard these peace process arguments before. We need to sort of get people talking in that language again. And so hearing these phrases reminds me of how we used to look at this peace process back then. And I think it's good for us to sort of inject more of those arguments back into the political debate right now. For example, it was twice mentioned that during the peace process, the countries that recognized Israel went from the 90-some countries to 150-some countries. And that was from talking to the Palestinians, not talking to the Emiratis or the Saudis. When they talked to the Palestinians, Israelis made a lot of friends around the world. So really, as normalization goes, the quickest way to global acceptance for Israel remains talking and finding a way for peace with Palestinians. That's the quickest short route to any kind of global acceptance. And it's good that we brought that again in this play. We saw it again, reminded ourselves what the benefits of talking about peace and getting to an agreement are. And those are my thoughts on the subject. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have a favorite song? The Barbra Streisand was good.
That was my favorite, but also the cover. We got it covered.
Oh,
It's
right.
also pretty catchy.
The king of the sterile zone. Yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed that.
Not so much a comment, or I really don't have anything to add on this, but it was an interesting echo of where you mentioned about growing international recognition of Israel as a state, to see that echoed 30 years later, where as a result of the last year plus of violence from October 7th onward, where there has been growth in recognition of a Palestinian state internationally. So it was, like I said, I don't have any commentary one way or the other on that, but it just is an interesting echo of how history, doesn't repeat itself.
more thoughts. I mean, what we saw here was a play where, if I tracked it right, there was the appearance, at least the voice, of one Palestinian, right, which was Yasser Arafat on the phone. Otherwise, we were in this world that was really confined to Israel, Israeli society. Obviously, some dozen or two characters that we got to experience. Certainly, I think the play did well to show, within Israeli society, the kinds of struggles and clashes and tensions that exist. If they existed then, I believe it's fair to say that in many ways there's both been a sort of ringing of the wagons, but also intensified fracturing in the society. Of course, something that's missing, other than by reference, is the voice of Palestinian citizens of Arabs, which is something I think across the board we hear so little, whether it's in news, in history, in political conversations, and so forth. But we find out in a very interesting conversation the role they played and the way they benefited Rabin, and the way he accepted, embraced their support in his move towards a new policy. As a Yasser Arafat, who may or may not be a fan of Palestinians may or may not be a fan of him. That's a very generational question in some sense. But at least was portrayed in this conversation as being on most personal terms and having concern for Rabin. I would just want to say that while we got to see this world, the sort of Israeli world with all its complexity and its contradictions, and the arguments that were made in various ways, the risks, the uncertainties that people had to live with, the personal relationships, the bigger dreams, the national identities, and so forth. Of course, the play only implies what's going on for Palestinians, both then and now. And, so I think to acknowledge that while this conversation is happening within Israeli society, there is a whole conversation happening within Palestinian and larger Arab society, both in the 1990s and today. And it has all that much of personal connection, dreams, struggles, contradictions, within tensions within it. And of course, especially in the last year, the incredible amount of violence that have been experienced by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths and many more displacements and so forth on the Gaza side. So just to name the obvious, but to put it there in the context of this.
It's an excellent point, and obviously that's why we have a thing called a festival, which is to allow for different works to ground themselves and anchor themselves in one orientation, and this is absolutely an internal look at a very, very divided society, but it doesn't make any attempt to platform a Palestinian voice. I wonder, as a sort of act of instantaneous art, Hakam, if we were to ask you to conceive of a play written by you, set in 1995, the year of this assassination, what do you imagine off the top of your head that play in Palestinian society would be? What play would you write? And this is just, you can disown this 5 minutes from now. But what would that counter narrative be of a complex society and Oslo, and the promise, the prospect, the problem of Oslo in Palestinian society?
Yeah, boy, I mean, it put me on the spot, really, Ali. I would work on something that reflects what you're talking about. So it would be an entirely Palestinian-focused play where Israelis were kind of referenced in a sort of background way, where
Mhm.
maybe you'd hear something on the radio or something, but it was really just like, take it within a Palestinian community dealing with the daily struggle, but without sort of identifying that their entire life revolves around the occupation. And I mean, we all know that, but let it in the background, because we all know there was Palestinians involved in that play, but we didn't really sort of see them or talk about them. And so the counter narrative would be to have a Palestinian play and not to actually mention Israelis and how they are involved in the Palestinian.
And then to have two Jews in a post-show discussion talking about it.
But I'm kind of curious too, because I really know more about the history of what happened in Israel after the assassination, but not how the Palestinian world saw this, or what happened after that in terms of trying to move forward with this, after all, from the Palestinian view. Is there so much known? What do you know?
Yeah, like the people that dealt with the man, with Rabin, came out saying that he was a tough negotiator. He wasn't an easy man to deal with by any stretch of the imagination, but everybody had huge respect for him on the Palestinian side. The people that actually knew him and talked to him, like beyond the news and the headlines and so on. I think for the average Palestinian, the history of Rabin wasn't sort of a stellar history in terms of dealing with the Palestinians. So nobody particularly loved him. And there was a lot of good riddance when the assassination happened. Now hindsight is 2020. When we saw what came after him, we look back at this time and say this was a great period for peace. But at the time, yeah, he was the guy that broke kids' bones during the first Intifada. We didn't really understand why he was the one that we had to deal with when we were talking peace. Couldn't there be somebody, dovier in Israel? And we've learned that no, there isn't. This is as dovey as it gets in Israel. Yeah.
What was the Palestinian reaction to Shimon Peres?
Honestly, Ari, it was
Same.
Yeah, half a dozen of one, six of the other. Like it's the same generation, but it was that generation that could make that peace. And my question is, can a newer generation of Israelis make the peace that Rabin's generation was able to make? Like, does anybody on the Israeli political scene today have the heft of that? What is it called? Founding generation of Rabin. Because he had a lot of political capital, and he invested a lot of it in that process. I don't see anybody on the Israeli scene today having that kind of heft.
Or that kind of respect within Israeli society.
Yes.
If they do have that commitment.
And so I think the future really on the Palestinian and the Israeli side is a collective one rather than an individual. I don't think we're going to find another Arafat or another Rabin, but we might be able to build movements that can talk to one another.
Can you talk about that for a moment? Both of you talk about the movements that give you some sense of forward motion.
Yeah. At the time there was a peace camp, we called it. We still call it a peace camp. There's me and you and a few sort of graying elders that were involved in it. And I don't know where it exists in this younger generation. I think we have a responsibility to reach out to our younger members of our communities and teach them how this peace was possible and how it can be regained again. Give them the language that we used to use back then, and show them the benefits for both sides. There's a responsibility, and then have those movements talk to one another. Yeah. You're involved with the new leadership, right? Yeah. Tell me how that works.
Yeah, maybe before that, I'll just say it's an interesting parallel that, Yasser Arafat wasn't also stellar when it came to Jewish Israelis and his history leading the PLO. Similarly, as you said with Rabin, Shimon Peres, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was the general in charge of Sabra and Shatila. So it was, despite being men of peace, they had war and military backgrounds. And I guess one of the lessons I would draw from this is that that doesn't disqualify you from being the next Nobel Peace Prize winner. And maybe that comes from the most unlikely of places, which as we may be seeing with the current peace plan process. And I say that actually genuinely wanting to make sure that I don't like lose sight of the possibility now of there being a peace, even as much as there is so much history, so many complaints I have under the current administration and the past Biden administration for what they've done, but this might still be a moment. You mentioned movements, so I'll give a quick plug, but as was mentioned, next week we'll talk about this in greater depth. One of the incredible privileges I've had over the last 2 years, so since October 7th, 23, which happens also to be my birthday, is that I was part of an initiative all involving youth leaders under 35, Israeli-Palestinian, including Gazans and Palestinian citizens of Israel, who were dissatisfied with merely putting out a joint statement demanding a ceasefire and a release of hostages and humanitarian access, one of the first statements after October 7th, and decided to match the magnitude of the crisis with an equally grand and ambitious post-war plan. And it's something that developed into what we later named the Phoenix Framework. And it attempts to address the systemic barriers. So it doesn't reiterate the final status issues, a position on refugees, or borders, or Jerusalem. I mean, it leaves in very many senses, it sort of leaves that to already an almost a consensus over countless
Can you tell us a
cycles.
little bit about the group that you'd mentioned?
Yeah,
News
so these
story,
were
but-
alumni of a program that for over a decade have been placed, one Israeli and one Palestinian, in congressional offices, have been doing speeches on the Hill, have been putting their voice into U.S. foreign policy making in sometimes incredibly powerful ways, like where policy is being made without any real experience of what the implications of that policy are, what the history is behind it. So we had this News Story Leadership is the organization that brings them here, and it was alumni of that program that were checking in with each other post October 7th that decided to dream big, and then took the Phoenix Framework once we finished it in about a 4 or 5 months period of time, and started to advocate with that on Capitol Hill now. Almost a year and a half of doing that, also with the EU, UN, Geneva, Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and now that we do have an opening, we do have space in Palestine and Israel to talk about post-war, and now that plan is being brought there. So I will say that, this play shows, and our current track one diplomacy shows that it is 70, 80, and 90-year-olds who are primarily making these decisions for both societies. And so there really needs to be, for any movement, I think, there needs to be connecting these generations and making space for the new generations to be able to envision. And in some ways that also means like updating what was a 1990s operating system to 2025, right? Like we are operating with MS-DOS. So much has happened in 30 years, demographically, politically, internationally, in terms of Palestinian society, culture, globalization, that's yeah, part of that is I think what's missing. We're still talking about the same security conversations, land and security conversations in the 1990s today, and we're missing, I think, a lot of the other aspects that resonate with people around this conflict and what is happening.
I don't have a follow-up to that. I think News Story leadership has always been doing a tremendous job. And yeah, there's any number of organizations that do people-to-people exchanges. That's good work. Rebuilding the movement that we had in the 90s is not going to be easy, though. I don't know how deeply I can get into this in this forum, but the two-state solution does have its supporters around the world. It still is the most internationally accepted version of a plan to resolve this conflict. Whether we like it or we don't, or we can love it or hate it, it is the most established peaceful resolution to this conflict that we have.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience leading the DC delegation of the PLO and now the new startup that you've created, and the relationship between your experience with the PLO and now what you've created?
Sure. Speaking about myself, I have been with the PLO delegation in DC since 2001 until they closed in 2018. I did mostly consular work during those years. There's about maybe 500,000 to 800,000 Palestinians in America that need all kinds of services that I provided for them proudly over these years. I say that we had all the responsibilities of an embassy without any of the perks, without any of the privileges. We had to do the work that every embassy did for their citizens. It's just that we never had any recognition as a state in the United States. Now, the office was closed in 2018, and I started this organization called Georgetown that is a dialogue conflict resolution organization that is, well, the plan was, and I wanted to launch it in October of 2023 to bring people from both sides and have them talk together and resolve their conflicts. The war put a damper, as you might know, about bringing Palestinians and Israelis and having them talk together and resolve their conflicts. So since then, I have been following the Gaza conflict very closely, writing an article every Wednesday, monitoring how reconstruction and this peace process is going to come through, and it's become my obsession and just Gentium's as well. You can find some details if you Google my name, support our group, and shoot me ideas if you like. That's my little plug.
Great.
Thank you,
There's
Ari.
a link here.
Is there?
So you all know. Yeah,
Very
nice.
Very nice. Yeah. Did you have anything else to add? Does anybody want to add anything?
Yes, I think Israeli society has changed over the last 30 years, and not necessarily in a way that makes peace more possible. The left in Israeli politics has been dwindling for basically the past 30 years. Not that there aren't people there, but there are less of them. They have less political support. So while the United States, other people can have some pressure, the state of Israeli politics is extremely depressing.
Yeah. They all left. They all left Israel. The Israeli left has left. They're all in DuPont Circle. I hang out with them all. I know them all. We hang out all the time. We're all here in DC. We're all trying to make a difference, and nobody's there. Like, who of that camp is still on the ground? And I'll say it's the same thing from the Palestinian side. It's brain drain. sort of the conservatives and the hawks on both sides have made it an intolerable place. If you're a person with talent and motivation and want to get something done, you oftentimes leave and you travel abroad and try to make a difference there. I mean, I don't know if anybody's done the math economically on where Israel could have been if that hadn't happened. If the Oslo Accords went through and if we had peace over these past 30 years, what would the Israeli economy look like right now? I bet you Israel has lost a lot because this peace wasn't finalized. There's growth potential. I think Rand has a calculator. You can punch in the year and the details, and it'll give you sort of an economic output of GDP per capita, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of smart people have worked on this. Some of the brightest minds in DC have banged their heads against the Middle East peace wall for a really long time. And there's some great ideas out there. I don't know why we pick the ones we end up with, but there's some terrific ideas out there.
But somehow we need people within Israeli society sort of starting somehow a different perspective, which seems to be lacking.
There are. I don't know. Are you?
And with the group,
Land for Peace, Standing Together. There's a lot of organizations that do this.
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations, but the amount of political support they have, sort of, it seems to me, is minuscule generally in Israel, and that there's no longer the sort of base that can sort of really support them, and so they're based on their ideas. They're no less of a political force than the left was 30 years ago.
That is the sad state of affairs that we live in. All right.
well, I think what promises for programming next Saturday night with the unveiling in this quarters of the Phoenix, it's called the Phoenix Proposal, the Phoenix
Framework. So
the Phoenix
that's
Framework.
out here, explorethephoenix.org if you want to check out. It's a 120-page document, but there's a summary.
Executive summary.
Yeah.
And the organizations that have been part of these conversations, from Combatants for Peace to Partners for Progressive Israel, which is sponsoring next weekend's final conversation, to, of course, Standing Together, which we talked about a little bit, but which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this weekend, and is a growing Israeli-Palestinian civil society movement that is impacting in important ways. And we're not seeing that in national elections yet.
Yeah.
But the renewal of a movement that has to happen, needs to happen, is happening, and it's our job to promote that and strengthen those initiatives. Thank you guys very much for being here tonight. Thank you all.